Hello, hello. Hello. This looks like an inquisitive group today. We are excited to have Barbara Lounsberry here today talking about some Nancy Drew stuff. How many of you had or read the Nancy Drew series with Okay, then you know probably what you're in for. Next week we have Willie Schneider, aka Billy James, and he'll be playing some country music and some 50s and 60s music. So he'll be here next week. Let's give Barbara a big hand. Let's get it started.
Tracy, and I want to thank Teresa Jackson for inviting me and making all the arrangements, and thank you for coming out. It's a real honor. I have to turn on my forgetful. Is that better? Raise your hand if you can't hear me and I can project too. But I wanted to say it's an honor to be at the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center, and just wanted to say, echo really what Clark wrote to Lewis in July 1803. He said, "My friend, I join you with heart and hand." So my friends, I join you with heart and hand. And as Tracy said, any talk of Nancy Drew must begin with confession. So, as Tracy did, how many of you, as I did, read one or more Nancy Drew mystery as you were growing up? How many of you read Nancy in the original blue-colored Nancy's? How many of you, maybe younger folks, read the yellow that came out in 1959, you younger people? Well, if you grew up reading and maybe even wanting to be Nancy Drew, as I confess I did, the truth is you joined fine company. Barbara Walters, the journalist, Beverly Sills, the opera singer, actresses Demi Moore and Candice Bergen, 3 of the Supreme Court justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sonia Sotomayor, and Ellen Kagan, and many other prominent women have spoken of being spurred on to achievement by having had Nancy Drew as an early role model. But this afternoon, we're here to remind ourselves that Nancy Drew was and is an Iowa heroine, as is the remarkable woman who created her. The story I come to tell you is a familiar story of Midwestern modesty, and I mean by that of achievement inadequately recognized or recognized long after the fact. And it's also a story of 2 women. This woman, Mildred Augustine of Ladora, Iowa, who at the age of 25 created the character of Nancy Drew and established Nancy clearly as an Iowan, a Midwesterner. It was 1930, 93 years ago, and the beginning of the Great Depression. And it's the story of this other woman, Harriet Stratemeyer Adams of New Jersey, who for the next 50 years appropriated Mildred Augustine's creation. Today, in 2023, Nancy Drew is the most popular fictional teen detective in the world. From her first appearance, Nancy was a success. In truth, she has become a publishing phenomenon. In the past 93 years, more than 200 million copies of Nancy Drew Mysteries have been sold, and she's been translated into 45 different languages. In the early 1990s, Nancy's sales surpassed those of her male counterparts, the Hardy Boys. Anybody read the Hardy Boys? They were created 3 years before her in 1927. But few know, however, that it was an Iowa woman who wrote the first 23 Nancy Drew mysteries. Well, she wrote the first 7 and then wrote 23 of the first 30 Nancy Drew mysteries. Now, I grew up in Iowa, and I think if I had learned that in school or at the public library, I think it would have encouraged me no end in terms of the possibilities for female Iowans. You see, there is no Carolyn Keene. Carolyn Keene is the pen name for Mildred Augustine and her successors who wrote the actual volumes. All had to sign contracts of secrecy, and the successive secrecy robbed Mildred Augustine of recognition for her important contributions to young girls' reading, and today we think to American popular culture, and it prevented young readers like us from identifying with a real human being. Well, I'm trying to remedy this. I'm here to restore Mildred Augustine and Nancy Drew to you as inspiring examples of Iowa character and Iowa lives. Well, the life of Mildred Augustine and the secret of Nancy Drew's success are as fascinating as any of her mysteries. So let me take you through their stories with a few photos as clues. Nancy Drew's actual father was this man, Edward Stratemeyer. He was a good friend of Horatio Alger Jr. Do any of you know the Horatio Alger books at all? They were like the Harry Potter of the late 1800s. They were written on a formula. I've got one here. Strive and succeed, try and trust. The formula was poor boy, works hard, what? Succeeds, right, but they were boys. These are books that helped create the American dream, really, in the late 1800s. Poor boy, works hard, succeeds, boys. Well, Edward Stratemeyer learned a lot from his friend Horatio Alger Jr., and in 1906 he founded the Stratemeyer Syndicate, which was really a fiction factory for juvenile fiction. If you grew up reading the Bobbsey Twins, anybody into the Bobbsey Twins? The Rover Boys, anybody? I've got some Rover Boys over there. Hardy Boys. Tom Swift, anybody? These were all Edward Stratemeyer's series. He created more than 60 of these adventure series, and he came up with an ingenious method of working. He would develop the idea for a new series, but then he relied on a stable of hired ghostwriters to flesh out his very brief plot outlines into manuscripts that he would then revise and proofread. Each series had a phony name as author. There is no Frank Dixon in the Hardy Boys. And the real writer signed a contract pledging they would not reveal that they were the real authors. They were paid a set fee for each manuscript, but the Stratemeyer Syndicate held the copyright for all the books and collected all the money. These honorable hired writers, including Mildred Augustine, kept their pledges of secrecy even when it was clear that Nancy Drew was selling more than 2 million.
Excuse me, Barbara, put your microphones.
Oh, it turned, didn't it? Oh. Is that better? Is that better? I'm sorry. Thank you. Mildred Augustine was born in Ladora, Iowa, and if you're ever driving down Highway 6, it's right on Highway 6, just east of Grinnell. She was born in 1905. She loved to read and write, and by the age of 13, she had written her first story. Like Nancy Drew, Augustine had brains and daring. She began as an academic pioneer. Here she is diving into the Iowa River in Iowa City. She was the first, in 1926, she was the first woman to earn a bachelor's degree from the University of Iowa's New School of Journalism. And in 1927, she was the first person, male or female, to earn a master's degree in journalism. Well, in 1926, should I just hold this? In 1926, with her bachelor's degree in hand, Augustine traveled to New York City to meet Edward Stratemeyer, who had advertised for ghostwriters for his syndicate. She returned to Iowa, and the first book she wrote for the syndicate was called, and I have it here, Ruth Fielding and Her Great Scenario. Little did Augustine know that she was about to embark on a great scenario in American popular culture as well. Well, Augustine wrote a number of the Ruth Fielding mysteries, and then in 1929, Stratemeyer sent her a brief plot outline for a new teen sleuth named Nancy Drew. As I mentioned before, in 1927, Stratemeyer had come up with the Hardy Boys, and they had proved such popular teen detectives that Stratemeyer thought America was ready. We were ready for a female counterpart. Well, Stratemeyer gave Augustine a brief plot line for the first mystery, but it was she who determined Nancy's character and personality. Augustine wrote the historic first Nancy Drew mystery, The Secret of the Old Clock. Anybody read that one? She wrote it in 2 months and mailed her manuscript to Edward Stratemeyer, but he was not pleased. Quote, Mr. Stratemeyer expressed bitter disappointment when he received the manuscript, she confessed later in an interview. He said Nancy was too flip and would not be well received. Now, afterward, I want you to tell me what he maybe meant in 1930 that Nancy was too flip. Fortunately, however, the syndicate's publisher, Grosset and Dunlap, disagreed and requested 2 more Nancy Drew mysteries in the spring of 1930 as test, or they called them breeder volumes. These were Mystery 2, The Hidden Staircase, my personal favorite. Anyone like that one? And the third was The Bungalow Mystery. Augustine has said that in these first 3 volumes, she concentrated hard on Nancy, trying to make her a departure from the stereotypical heroines of her day. Augustine thought those girls were too silly. So she made an effort to make Nancy as intelligent, agile, and resourceful. I kind of think like a typical Iowa girl. Well, clearly she was onto something, for from her first appearance, Nancy was an immediate success, and Augustine soon received an outline for the 4th volume, The Mystery at Lilac Inn. Anyone do that one? This was the last book she wrote for the syndicate before Edward Stratemeyer died. Nancy Drew, it turned out, was Edward Stratemeyer's last and greatest brainchild. But let me carry on with Mildred Augustine's story. She is 25 in 1930, and she's written the first 4 Nancy Drew mysteries. Edward Stratemeyer dies, and his daughter Harriet takes over the syndicate and becomes almost obsessive in her proprietary feelings about Nancy Drew. Nancy Drew was just so nationally popular, and Harriet considered Nancy her own special daughter. She'd say, my daughter, Nancy Drew. That for the next 50 years, she told everyone she was Carolyn Keene, and Mildred Augustine had signed a contract of secrecy. I can show you letters sent to Iowans that Harriet signs Carolyn Keene. So she really perpetuated. But Augustine had her standards, After writing the first 7 Nancy Drew mysteries, Augustine was told by Harriet that because of the Depression, her fee for each book would be lowered from $125 per manuscript to $100 per manuscript. Well, Augustine refused. There she is. She refused to work for those reduced wages, and so Nancy Drew Mysteries 8, 9, and 10, we now know were written by a man. But Harriet didn't like the way he wrote Nancy Drew, so in 1934, she came back to Augustine for volumes 11 through 25, volume 25 being The Ghost of Blackwood Hall, published in 1948. Therefore, it's accurate to say that after establishing the character of Nancy Drew in the first 7 volumes, the Iowa writer Mildred Augustine went on to write Nancy Drew for 14 straight years, from 1934 to 1948. In truth, Nancy Drew was just a small part of Mildred Augustine's life, undertaken to pay the bills. She was a working journalist, and Augustine wrote 130 young people's books, and that's your second hand out in case you want to look for them at garage sales or antique stores. I have a few of them. She used a number of different pen names. She wrote the Dana Girls, too. And there is no doubt, however, that Augustine gave facets of herself to her Nancy Drew character. When she wrote the 3rd Nancy Drew volume, The Bungalow Mystery, in 1930, for example, Augustine was working as a swimming instructor in Iowa City. There she is. And in that book, if you remember it, Nancy teaches her friend Helen Corning how to swim. It's fascinating that Mildred Augustine was writing Nancy Drew in the 1930s at the same time that Agatha Christie over in England was writing her mysteries, and both of these mystery writers were fascinated by archaeology. Mildred Augustine learned to fly her own airplane when she got tired of hiring bush pilots to fly her into remote archaeological digs. Here's a photo of Mildred in Guatemala, and during this dig, she was kidnapped. But, like Nancy Drew, she escaped. Augustine flew her own Piper Cherokee. Indeed, she had 6 different pilot's licenses, including one for seaplaning, which appears in volume 14, The Mystery of the Whispering Statue. Augustine's passion for flying is also found in The Clue in the Crumbling Wall, volume 22, published in 1945. In that book, if you remember, Nancy herself becomes an experienced pilot. Away from Nancy Drew, Augustine wrote the Ruth Darrow flying stories, modeling her heroine on the real-life aviator Ruth Elder. Well, in 2002, Mildred Augustine was 96 years old and still living in the Midwest in Toledo, Ohio. In her 80s, she got arthritis and had to give up flying and had to give up golf. You probably remember that Nancy Drew is a great golfer. In one of the books, she wins a tournament with a broken hand. I love that detail. But in May 2002, Augustine was still writing her column for the Toledo Blade on the day she died at 96. Anyone want to guess what she called her column? On the go. Thus, Mildred Augustine remains an inspiring role model for us all. And recognition is slowly catching up with her. In 1993, Augustine reached an agreement with Simon & Schuster, who now publishes the Nancy Drew books, under which she is finally given credit for writing the original stories. Since 1993, Augustine is acknowledged in all the printings of the 23 books she wrote, including the translations. They have this statement on the copyright page. Acknowledgement is made to Mildred Augustine, Wirt Benson, those are married names, who, writing under the pen name Carolyn Keene, wrote the original Nancy Drew books. Finally. Well, let me contrast Mildred Augustine's modest story with the immediate and very public success of her heroine. Nancy Drew has proven to be an Iowa heroine for all seasons, changing her blue roadster into a blue Mustang convertible and her dress and hat for jeans as the decades have moved on. Would anyone like to guess what Nancy Drew drives today? She went from a blue roadster, blue Mustang convertible.
Jeep, eco thing.
Yes, an environmentally sound electric car. Blue, of course. Well, for those of you who remember and love the early Blue volumes, which Mildred Augustine wrote, people love the illustrations. And this is Russell Tandy, who was the illustrator for many of the early Nancy Drew books. And he said he based his drawing on an actual New York model named Grace Horton. Can you kind of see a little bit the similarity? Well, and I wanted to tell some of you collectors just a little piece of information about the famous Nancy Drew silhouette. From 1930 to 1946, the silhouette looked like this, the one on the screen. For some odd reason that I don't know, Harriet took away the shadow under her feet and the scarf after 1946. So I only have a few that have the scarf and the shadow. Most of mine that you'll see up there don't have the scarf and shadow. So if you do have a Nancy Drew book with the scarf and shadow, it's worth more. And of course, if you have a jacket, it's worth more as well. Over the years, Nancy Drew has created an amazing legacy. In the 1930s, there were 4 Nancy Drew films. She was so popular. This was 1938 and 1939. You can see them on Turner Classic Movies. Has anybody seen them? They're black and white. They're an hour. They're not very good, but you can see them. Does anyone recognize this not very famous actress who played Nancy Drew in those black and white 30s films?
Her name was Benita Granville.
Benita Granville, and that's Frankie Thomas, who played Nancy's boyfriend in the movies. Does anyone remember Nancy's boyfriend's name in the story? Ned Nickerson. Well, I have to tell you that Hollywood did not like the name Ned. So in the movie, in the 30s movies, he is Ted Nickerson. Some of you may have seen, I hope these young women have seen, the 2007 film called Nancy Drew and the Mystery of Hollywood Hills. It was a major motion picture that you can stream or rent or get. And it starred Emma Roberts, Julia Roberts' niece. And it's rather charming, I think, if you want to rent it. It starts out in Iowa in a church. And that's the best part. She solves a mystery, but then for some reason they whisk her off to Hollywood, but they fly in the roadster, and so you might want to see that. So there are the films. There's the television series. Do any of you remember the 1977 Sunday show, the Nancy Drew Hardy Boys mystery? This is Pamela Sue Martin, who played Nancy Drew in that series. Next to her is William Shallert, who played her father, Carson Drew, who is always described in the mysteries as the most famous criminal lawyer in the state. And I'm thinking, do we have one? And now, of course, on CW, are any of you watching the Nancy Drew that's in its 5th season? My God. But it's set in New England, so I'm a little troubled by that. But she's on TV, even now, and you can tell me if you like it or not. So films, TV, this was a play created in Minnesota. Tyrone Guthrie, Nancy Drew, Girl Detective, and I always want to say that this program cover was designed by a Cedar Falls artist where I'm from named Kim Bain. Here are the Minnesota actors who played in the play. I'm sure you recognize Nancy at the top, right, with the hat. But do any of you remember the name of her chums? Beth and George. And do you know who is who? Who's the curly-haired? You know. That's Beth, right? And George is on your right, the dark-haired one. Well, I have to tell you that in the early stories, they make a few weight jokes about Bess. She's a little plump, funny weight jokes. But today, no. Bess has had an extreme makeover, right? Today, Bess is a computer guru. And on TV, it's totally different as well if you're watching that series. Nancy Drew has also affected the art world, and a wonderful Hawaiian printmaker named Laura Ruby loved the Nancy Drew books as she was growing up, and she's created, and you can go online and see these all, a print for each of the first 46 Nancy Drew mysteries, and I thought I'd just share a couple with you because I just think they're wonderful. And Laura was taken with the name, of course, Nancy Drew, because Drew is the past tense of draw, and she's an artist, and she makes use in her prints of, the texture of the volumes, the illustrations, the silhouette, and the magnifying glass. And she said to me, we kind of traveled around talking about Nancy Drew, and she told me that, when you look at a work of art, you're a little bit like a detective, trying to figure out what's going on in a work of art. So see what detective work you can do with these. This is Laura's print for the hidden staircase. Do you like all the staircases? The silhouettes are going up and down. This is Laura's print for the mystery of the brass-bound trunk. That's the mystery where Nancy goes on a cruise, and of course a mystery occurs. You can see at the top right, can you see Nancy Drew drawing on the floor? Of course her steamer trunk carries her little silhouettes on the bottom, and a flashlight on the top. And if you look over on the left, you can see there are flags. Can you see the flags a little bit on the left? Do any of you do semaphore? Well, I asked Laura what they said, and she told me, anybody want to guess? You would think it was Nancy, it's 5 letters. She said it says, help! This is Laura's print for the Haunted Bridge, the mystery of the Haunted Bridge. There's Nancy, of course, in front, picking up one of her illustrations. There's George and Bess. Can you see Nancy down on the river painting? I can move. Right here, she's painting. And do you notice what the bridge is made of? Is it dark enough? Can you see what the bridge is made of? They're the blue books. Can you see them stacked up on the top? Well, this is Laura's print of the mystery of the fire dragon. You can see the dragon is holding the pen on the right for Nancy Drew. There's the silhouette and the magnifying glass. And Laura tells me that this tile in Mahjong means something. Does anyone know? Do you want to guess? Help! This is Laura's print of The Secret of the Wooden Lady. There's the pen again for Nancy Drew, the silhouette, the flashlight, and I don't know why Buster Keaton is up on the left, but that's just Laura's sense of humor. Well, I wanted to include this one particularly for you Iowans. This is Laura's print of the Clue in the old album. You can see the album on the table. But do you notice anything kind of in the middle? In the big window, does it remind you of anything? What? Yes. No. The big glass with the two people in front. It's American Gothic, Grant Wood's painting, but they're carrying a magnifying glass instead of a pitchfork. And I don't know what Charlie Chaplin is doing to the right of that, but that's just Laura. And this is the last one. This is my favorite. The Clue of the Broken Locket. There's the famous roadster, of course. Nancy's driving it up. The fire dragon is in the engine. The silhouette is in the caboose. And it's doing something that they say in Hawaii. Does anyone know what that means? Hang loose. So Nancy's telling you, hang loose. You can see the grass is the texture of the blue books. And if you look at the smoke coming out of the engine, do any of you do Morse code? SOS, help, once again. Yeah. Well, so you can see the amazing influence Nancy Drew has had. And of course, once Nancy Drew became a national and international icon, the merchandisers were not far behind. So today, if you want, you can own the Nancy Drew doll, the lunchbox, the game. I've seen only one of those. If you ever see one, grab it. A woman in Makokada, when I was giving this talk, brought it in. It's just a board game, and you move around the board with a roadster, but I'd love to have one. Teresa told me about the puzzle that I'm going to get. Here's the cookbook. I have a couple copies of that, although Nancy rarely cooked, I have to tell you. The license plate, the cameo, and if you like to go online, there are several Nancy Drew sites that you can look at. There's the official, of course, Simon & Schuster Nancy Drew site, but there's a group called the Nancy Drew Sleuths, and it's just one word, Nancy Drew Sleuths, and they're a national, international group of Nancy Drew fans, and they go on cruises, they have conferences, and they came to Ladora, and I got to meet them, and they gave me this locket, which says Nancy Drew. It's kind of fading, but if you're really interested, you might want to connect with the Nancy Drew Sleuths. And like the Energizer Bunny, Nancy Drew keeps on going and multiplying. Well, in 1979, Harriet Stratemeyer Adams finally let go after 50 years of trying both to camouflage Nancy Drew's Iowa roots and to move her further east toward New Jersey. She didn't succeed in that. Since then, Simon & Schuster has increased the number of volumes published each year and spun off the Nancy Drew Files for readers 13 through 17. You probably know that the Nancy Drew books are kind of intended for 8 to 12-year-olds. So the files go from 13 to 17. And finally, Nancy Drew on Campus. They finally sent Nancy to college. They've also worked the other end of the age spectrum with the Nancy Drew notebooks. I have a couple of those down there for beginning readers, ages 5 through 8. So from the minute you can read a Nancy Drew mystery. What then is the secret of Nancy Drew's enduring appeal? Why has she flourished while other series book heroines have faded away, like Cherry Ames and Vicki Barr? Why have they faded into obscurity and not Nancy Drew? Well, let me quickly propose two theories. In the first place, Nancy Drew was a brilliant response to her time, the Great Depression. Nancy's role, when you think about it in the books, is often that of a female Robin Hood, restoring inheritances and other lost items to worthy people in distress. No doubt that is how many of Nancy's readers felt in the 1930s, that they were worthy people in distress who had lost their rightful inheritances, like their bank accounts. In many of the early mysteries, Nancy, like Robin Hood, works to kind of redistribute the wealth from the undeserving rich to the deserving poor. Well, our Mildred Augustine of Iowa deserves sole credit for the second stroke of brilliance that led to Nancy's great popularity. In the 1930s, as you probably know, girls and women didn't have as many roles open to them as they have today. Augustine's genius was to make Nancy Drew a blend of the three acceptable roles for women at that time and girls. You could be the beautiful charmer, if you could pull it off, or maybe you were the outdoor girl, or the New England brain. Think of Katharine Hepburn. She was working this same territory at the same time, the 1930s. Nancy Drew was pretty, she was athletic, and she was smart. She had it all. The Nancy Drew books are not perfect, however. In terms of class, today we recognize that Nancy Drew is privileged, right? She had her own roadster, right? Hannah Gruen, the cook, came in and cooked for Carson and Nancy. The early blue volumes also reveal some of the stereotypes of the time. The police are usually Irish, and occasionally African-American maids and caretakers are shown talking in an embarrassing dialect. It's hard to know what role Augustine had in that, but the truth is most of the Stratemeyer series fell victim to some of the stereotyping and xenophobia, fear of foreigners during the World War periods. These old-fashioned stereotypes were changed. We have to give Harriet credit for that with the yellow volumes that came out in 1959. People actually complained about the stereotyping in language. So she kind of redid the blue series and made it a yellow series in 1959. So the Roadster became the Mustang convertible, the Icebox became a refrigerator, and she changed some of these stereotypes. But I hate to tell some of you, though this is not a terrible thing, but Harriet also shortened them and dumbed them down a little bit. And so they're not quite as long and have things that what Mildred wrote in the blue volumes. Should then you give Nancy Drew mysteries to your daughters and granddaughters, maybe even your sons and grandsons? I would say that in spite of the early flaws, I would urge you to give your students and your children any of Mildred Augustine's Nancy's. Why not give them the original ones that our Iowa writer wrote? So that means, if you really want to try to do this, blue, they got to be blue volumes 1 through 7, 11 through 25, and volume 30. And when you give it to them, say that a remarkable Iowa woman created this paragon. In that first volume, The Secret of the Old Clock, Augustine writes, quote, "Like a true daughter of the Middle West, Nancy Drew took pride in the fertility of her state and saw beauty in a crop of waving green corn as well as in the rolling hills and expanse of prairie land." Surely this is Iowa, and we should be proud of our Iowa heroines to the world, Mildred Augustine and Nancy Drew, for perpetuating across 93 years the legacy of girls and women as extremely observant of people's actions and expressions. When I taught Henry James, the great American author at UNI, James would say, try to be someone on whom nothing is lost. Nancy Drew is someone on whom nothing is lost. The legacy of girls and women as intelligent, as excellent information gatherers, analysts, and problem solvers. She does this in every book, which is how the mystery gets solved. The legacy of girls and women as fearless, physically and mentally. Think what it must have meant in the 1930s when our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was saying, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. There was Nancy Drew out there, fearless physically and mentally. The legacy of girls and women is determined, undaunted by criticism, obstacles, or adversity. You probably remember in every Nancy Drew mystery, someone tries to stop Nancy, right? Often it's the police, and she's got to keep going. The legacy of girls and women as natural leaders. We all know that many girls and women are natural leaders. And when push comes to shove in the mysteries, the mystery needs to be solved, everyone turns to Nancy, right? Even Ned Nickerson, even Ned Nickerson's friends, because Nancy is a leader and can solve the mystery. The legacy of girls and women is able to admit frustrations and discouragement, but to persevere. And I was always tempted at UNI to use the Nancy Drew mystery when I was teaching our students how to do research, because when you're doing research, often you come to a wall, you get stopped. And this is true if you just have a problem in life, right? You know, you're kind of stuck. Well, you gotta learn to do what Nancy does. When she gets stuck, she goes over her clues until something presents itself, and that's exactly what researchers need to do. The legacy of girls and women is possessing a strong sense of calling. There was a good reason why they didn't send Nancy to college for about 50 years, you know. She knew from the first mystery, right, when she was 16, what she wanted to do with her life, what her calling was. What is Nancy Drew's calling? Yeah. The detective, solve mysteries, you know. What's she going to major in college, like forensics, criminology? The legacy of girls and women is willing to break and bend the law for a higher good. And often we think of human law, you know, and higher law, whether you call it natural law or God's law. When I would teach the famous Greek play Antigone, you probably remember Antigone, the young girl who has to go against her uncle, the king, Creon, because he's leaving her brothers out on the field, their dead corpses, to be eaten by birds. And Antigone has to break the law to go out and bury her brothers, and suffers the consequences. So, willing to break the law for a higher good. Well, you probably remember Nancy Drew sometimes breaks the speed limit when she's going after a criminal. Sometimes she breaks and enters when she's trying to rescue someone. Well, Antigone is high culture, Nancy Drew is popular culture, but you get the point. The legacy of girls and women as possessing a strong helping instinct and desire to help others feel secure. Nancy does this in every book. Someone starts off, you know, lost or in trouble. In the end, they are restored. The legacy of girls and women is valuing inclusion, not exclusion, valuing equality, not snobbery. And she is modest to boot, which is a very Midwestern quality. Well, this is the legacy of Mildred Augustine and Nancy Drew. I submit to you it is an Iowa legacy, so go forth and keep doing it. Keep sleuthing. Thank you. time for questions, or I'm going to hang around while we're all having cookies. But does anyone have any questions? Yes.
How did Mildred Augustine select the name Nancy Drew, and how did she settle on the pen name Carolyn Keene?
I don't think she did those. I think that was Edward Stratemeyer. So he came up with the name Nancy Drew and just sent her it was like a 3 or 4 page outline for The Secret of the Old Clock. And so he came up with all the pen names like Frank Dixon for the Hardy Boys and Carolyn Keene. So she didn't have any say in that. The only thing she did was write the whole book and gave Nancy her personality and character. So yes.
Okay,
Yes.
and a follow-up to that, what brought Harriet S. Adams around to finally give the credit where credit was due to Augustine for her writing?
There's a book here, and you may want to get it. I'm pretty hard on Harriet Stratemeyer Adams. There's a book here that kind of talks about them all or both of them as, important feminists and gives Harriet a little bit of due. But I don't really. She had to. The syndicate, or she sold. When she sold the rights from Grosset and Dunlap to Simon & Schuster in 1979, Grosset and Dunlap, as you can imagine, didn't want to lose them because she was so popular. So they sued to get the rights. And so it was only in court that Grosset and Dunlap trotted out Mildred Augustine. What would she have been there, 74 in 79, and said, here's who wrote it. And Harriet said to her, I thought you were dead. And another sad story, again, I'm just giving you my side, the Iowa side, but Mildred married an older reporter named Asa Wirt. He was quite a bit older, and they had a daughter, Peggy, and they were both working journalists, but Asa had a series of strokes beginning in the late 30s. And so Mildred really became the sole breadwinner for the family while he was ill. And in one interview, she said, this is when she's turning out all these other books because they were paying the rent. And she told an interview, she said, well, I put my typewriter beside his bed while I was nursing him. And if my books sound tired, it was because I was tired. And but at that time, she was writing Nancy from 34 to 48. This is all Asa's illness, and Harriet did nothing for her, only $125 per manuscript. So multiply 23 times 125, and that's what Mildred Augustine received, and Harriet received millions. But so I'm not too sympathetic. Harriet did fine, but I'm so glad that recognition is now coming. There was a film, a Nancy Drew on Campus film on TV, and at the end it saluted Mildred Augustine Benson. So people are starting to know her major contribution, because it was, she came up with that flip, whatever that character was that Edward Stratemeyer didn't like. I should say, explain that first handout I gave you that lists all the titles. I got that from the Nancy Drew scrapbook that was published in 1993, and so it was helpful to me when I was trying to collect the books, because I could mark off, did I have the yellow, did I have the blue, and so I thought it might be helpful to you, but I just wanted to tell you, it ends in 1993, and Nancy Drew has gone on, 30 years since. So there are many more Nancy Drews that are on that sheet that I gave you, but maybe it'll help you if you want to do a little collecting or see what you have. Any other questions before we go? Well, thank you for coming out on a Sunday, and I'll meet you over there for cookies.